Khadija Ihsan, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? I think I can talk without the mic. Okay. Okay, so we will proceed with a topic that personally, as a journalist and as a moderator, and as someone who spends her life literally listening to leaders, experts, and citizens, I feel that the world is not moving like a map anymore, but it's moving like a constellation. Technologies are definitely reshaping, and we've been hearing about it since the beginning of this Atlantic dialogues, and it's in all conversations. Technologies, AI, reshaping our mindsets, reshaping our societies, reshaping our economies faster than policies can catch up. So I've learned one thing through years of covering transitions and crisis, namely, real transformations never arrive softly. Industrial transformation, post-war reconstruction, digital age certainly won't and didn't. Sorry. So this session, ladies and gentlemen, is about reimagining the very architecture of competitiveness and productivity. And it's my immense pleasure to call now on stage my very distinguished speakers, and I'll start with Mr. Masoud Ahmed, President Emeritus of the Center of Global Development. She is Fellow and Deputy Director of Stimson Center, Lana Blake, ladies and gentlemen. And then I now welcome on stage Mr. Carlos Lopez, Honorary Professor at the Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. And last but by no means least, Professor Arkibi Okubai, British Academy Global Professor at the University of London. And before we get started, let's follow this introductive video of this session.
Across the globe, traditional models of economic growth are reaching their limits. What once worked no longer meets the challenges of our time, from technological disruption to climate urgency and a fragmented global order. As these pressures reshape the global landscape, a new question emerges. What does growth mean today? Can progress still be measured by numbers alone, or by how societies become more innovative, inclusive, and sustainable? In response, nations and businesses are now testing new paths, where digital transformation, green transitions, and human potential drive development, rethinking how value is created, how opportunity is shared, and how resilience is built. As these transformations unfold, the future of growth will depend not only on how fast we advance, but on the purpose that guides us. The challenge is clear. Can we design growth that truly serves both people and the planet and delivers prosperity fit for the 21st century? What does growth mean in a world defined by digital and ecological transitions? How can emerging economies position themselves in this evolving landscape?
And before answering these questions, among others, by our experts, I would now invite the audience to interact by answering to this very simple question on the application. It's the one-word question. What is the most overrated idea in development today? AI, overrated. Sovereignty, security, AI. Okay, we'll give it 15 more, 20 more seconds. Empowerment, corruption. Interesting. Growth. So, growth is an overrated idea in development today. Democracy. Okay. Okay. So, democratically, I think in AI has won as the most overrated idea in development today. Mr. Masood. So my question is very simple. How would you define growth today?
Look, I would define growth today in the core sense in much the same way we've defined it before, which is how can you improve lives and living standards for people in a country? And the only way you do that is by increasing the level of income. And that's just another way of saying growth. But it's more complicated now than it used to be. And it's more complicated because we don't just want average levels of income to go up, which is what growth measures. We're concerned about how they're shared because we're worried about inequality and we want it to be inclusive. We're also much more conscious that with increased economic activity, you get increased carbon emissions. And now we have more concerned about how to reduce the amount of carbon emissions for any given level of economic activity because climate poses a real budget for us. And also, we're much more concerned that growth isn't the same as jobs. You can have growth in a number of countries with many jobs being created or with very few jobs being created. So I think we're concerned about many aspects of what we want, and it's also become more complicated to deliver them. You know, we had AI up on the screen. Technology is disrupting it. I mean, you can say it's overrated in the hype, but in terms of what it will do to the way in which manufacturing is done, services are done, government's work, it's going to transform that over time. So that makes it more difficult. And the other thing is that the international context is very much more complex now. Before, you got on with it, the rules were clear, you produced, you went up the manufacturing ladder, you went from bicycles to motorcycles to refrigerators to cars, and you added value. And now, every time you do that, you run the risk of somebody putting a tariff on it or having protection. So the international context, politics is getting much more into the middle of growth, and that makes it more complicated. The last thing I'll say is, well, what does this mean for governments who are trying to help move this along? I think one thing is that you have to think of intelligent partnerships between governments and the private sector. There's always been some element of partnership, but now we have to think much more strategically about what you might call industrial policy, you might call it strategic partnership, but that's really important now. And you have to be much more agile at being able to change. The speed of change has accelerated. So what you could afford to take 10 years, and it's not just a question for emerging markets, I would say many rich countries are struggling to change their economies, keeping up with the speed at which the changes are made. Morocco is a big exporter of cars now. That wasn't the case 2 decades ago. But the cars that Morocco exports today are not going to be the cars that Morocco has to export in 10 years because there has to be many more electric cars in 10 years. And that's the speed of change we have to transform. Mm-hmm. So this constant change that is needed, and for that you need a human capital base that is going to be much more adept at coping with technology, coping with change. And I think in many countries, the Achilles heel is going to be, do we have enough of the people who are going to be able to deliver in the new context for growth?
Exactly. Building up on the human capital, I'll turn to Lana. So the system, as we know it today, that's mainly influenced, especially in the West, by major tech companies, and they've really shifted the paradigms within the economics, and especially for the middle class. So, building upon what Mr. Massoud just stated, what's your stand toward, first, this new system, and two, toward building this youth, this human capital that would respond not only to this very over-capitalistic system, and also to this technological shift that we're living in?
Thank you, Khadija. Is it working?
Yes, it is.
It is important to include the youth. They are the future. And we cannot develop and build this world without them. And I feel like there is a huge gap happening right now with AI and the technology, because humanity all over the world, not just in developed countries, but even in developing countries, they are suffering because there is a huge now shift and creating a huge kind of disaster, human disaster. A lot of people were going to fall into poverty because of this shift in technology, and they are not prepared for new jobs. And that is the role of governments and policymakers, how to prepare the youth for this AI and new technology, or we will lose the youth. And I want to take it into the social and institutional perspective. 82 billion, including the population of the world, is 8.2 billion, including over 1.2 billion young people aged 15 to 24. Roughly 20% of youth worldwide are not in employment, education, or training. That's huge. And this, in North Africa precisely, this figure rises to 22 to 23%, illustrating the gap between talent and opportunity. Economic conditions add pressure. Global growth is projected at 3.1 to 3.3% in 2025, while global inflation remains around 3.6, with higher levels in emerging markets. These realities demonstrate that traditional GDP-focused strategies are insufficient. Growth must integrate resilience, social protection, and institutional capacity. Technological transformation offers both opportunity and risk. AI, digital finance, e-commerce, and renewable energy are generating new sectors and improving productivity. But without inclusive access, workforce readiness, and sound governance, these advances can widen inequality rather than foster shared prosperity. North Africa illustrates this dynamic. Emerging markets in North Africa, startups and renewal projects are growing, yet youth unemployment remains high, highlighting the importance of pairing innovation and inclusion. The next stage of growth rests on three strategic pillars. Invest in adaptive institutions. Effective governance and regulatory framework determine whether innovation and social programs translate into real impact. Design markets for inclusion. Policies and incentives must integrate informal sectors, SMEs, and marginalized communities into growth opportunities. Embed systematic foresight. Growth strategies should anticipate shocks from climate to security and supply chain disruptions, and embed flexibility into fiscal, social, and technological planning. In short, the next stage of growth is not just about faster GDP expansion, it's about creating strategies that reflect the realities of our societies, harness human potential, and protect youth amid global uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I'll turn to Carlos. So Lena just gave us like a very broad global perspective on, especially on the youth and public policies and this huge technological shift. Let's talk about our African perspective and emerging economies. So these economies must navigate between major geoeconomic shifts and also seize opportunities. So how can these emerging economies become co-authors of the next development paradigms in the continent of Africa?
Well, the short answer is that they already are. We have a dislocation of the center of gravity from the traditional countries that have, produced wealth to others that are now competing, global south in general. And Africa, paradoxically, is also part of this evolution. People don't recognize it enough because the narratives are always pessimistic about Africa. But when you group all African countries, meaning you don't divide them, slice them like North Africa, Sub-Saharan. If you just talk about the continent as a whole, and you talk about the other continents as a whole, because it's very easy to say emerging Asia, and then you put all the good ones in one corner, and then you talk about the rest of Asia. Then you say, you see, this emerging Asia is the standard. So if you just compare continent per continent, and for that you have to do an extra effort, because the IMF will not give you the statistics that I'm going to give you, you end up with a very different picture. Africa is the continent that is growing the most from 2025 onwards. Of course, these are forecasts. So we have surpassed Asia.
But then it depends on the very definition of growth.
I'm coming.
Okay.
So then we have 40 countries out of the 54 that are above the world average. We have 13 out of 20 that are fastest growing. You can go on with the statistics, and people say, where is it? Where is this growth? How can you explain that Niger is in a complete disaster in terms of governance and territorial integrity, but it's actually having incredible growth, between 6 and 8%, depending on the last year.
Exactly.
So then you end up with this definition of growth that is not really compatible with what people's expectations are, which is what Masoud was explaining. So because, if I cut all the trees in my forests, my GDP goes up, but then I'm, in complete drought. So we cannot just rely on GDP as a measurement. So what is the alternative? Well, Human Development Report and Human Development Index have tried. And basically, it's about expanding people's opportunities. So if you have more education, you have more choices that you can make. If you have good health, of course, you live a better life. If you have more income, you can have more consumption. If you live longer, of course, you have more chances in life, and so on and so forth. So expanding opportunities is a better definition. And we have, toyed with it, and we classified in different ways. But what is interesting is that we keep tweaking, not necessarily to make it more reliable, but less. Because, there are pressures politically for countries to be ranked better than normally they would be otherwise, and so on. So let's just try to get out of that game and try to understand really what is happening. And what is happening is that we have major disruption. There is no hype with AI that justify for people to say it's overrated. AI is going to disrupt our lives. Not necessarily in the negative sense, but in the way we have conceived economic concepts that are no longer going to be possible to sustain. So how do we measure productivity?
Exactly.
We measure productivity by saying, well, I'm putting it simple, we produce where is the cheapest, the fastest, and the best quality. Well, it's no longer going to be like that. Because now we are going to enter into carbon, we are going to enter security concerns. So I'm not going to produce in this country because it's environmentally problematic. So I issue my own unilateral measures about carbon, like the European Union is doing with CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And you basically are changing already the rules of the game. So you cannot measure productivity the same way. How do we extract value? Another very important concept. Well, AI is about stealing intellectual property. That's what it is. You mine the data and you steal. So when you steal the data, you can no longer attach your value that was extracted from intellectual property the same way. You need a new regulation. So we have to change the rules of the game. And you can go on with the various dimensions of how AI is going to disrupt the concepts that we are used to. For instance, 60% of the stock exchanges in the United States, which is the largest in the world, is now tech-driven. And the rest of the economy is 40%, is less. So you know that Mr. Elon Musk is associated with Tesla. Tesla was running a deficit for 17 years. Running a deficit. And people were pouring money into the company. Why? Because they knew it was going to disrupt. So we better pay attention to disruption more and not stick our mind to the growth models as we have defined them up to now.
That means that public policies should follow.
Exactly. So that means that the way Africans are going to navigate the geopolitics and the mega trends like climate, demographics, technology, will have to bear in mind that this is not about trying to sustain the legacy of the structures, concepts, models that we had in the past.
Yeah.
Things are going to change quite dramatically.
Arkebe, I'm very keen to hear from you and your definition of the growth in 2025.
I mean, the first thing is we need to look at how growth has been defined historically. For instance, GDP-based model originated primarily in the mid-1930s. And then came the purchase power parity in the mid-60s. While we also see productivity increment, productivity growth as a very important measure to show not only growth rate, but also competitiveness of the economy. So from a broader perspective, probably that really shows the quality of growth, and also long-term perspective is the productivity rate. When we look at this, then it brings us what are the key long-term drivers of productivity. And historical evidence, economic history shows, and also the study and research we have been conducting in the last, let's say, 2 decades, show that there are 3 major drivers in the long term. For instance, today we have been talking a lot about Trump. Trump is a noise. It's a very short term. What we need to look is the long-term perspective of decades, centuries, how economies are driven. The first one is technology is one of the key drivers of economic growth. So that's why we see automation, that's why we see robotization, AI, digital transformation, etc. Then we have a second major driver of economic growth, and this is demography. Demography is a major game changer in the long term. And it has proven when we look at the past millennia. So what is happening? Let's look at the coming century. We all know the data about 2050, that, for instance, Africa will be accounting about 1/4 of global population, which means 1 from 4 inhabitants of the planet. But if we go 50 more years, by year 2000, 40% of global population, world population, will be living in Africa. And these are young workforce. And then we have to relate with the aging of many economies, advanced economies, industrial-based economies, but also China since 2023. And Asia is going to start as well as, aging as well. So demography is key game changer that affects productive capacity, that affects market growth, that affects the need for jobs. Then there is a third element we need to consider now, which has not been put in many economics literature. This is the issue of green transformation. Sustainability is now become central. Even with the retreat in the US by Trump, or even in Europe, where the momentum has slowed, green transformation is now mainly driven by the global south. And the way it's happening is green technologies making energy and mobility more sustainable. So the key element, game changer, has been technology. And second also, is new industries are being created that can drive global economy. So we are seeing sustainability becoming central, and for countries to grow in the future, growth can only be defined if it's sustainability.
So I'll just build up on what you just stated. And to ask you a very basic question, when you say that the Global South will rely a lot on sustainability and green transition, what about the countries, for instance, in Africa, that depend a lot on exporting fossil fuels? So they should just transition and just forget about the fossil fuels, and knowing that,
Yeah.
I mean, you know the numbers, that Africa is not a big polluter. So,
Yeah, true.
and that's a dilemma
Yeah.
for the global south. I mean, what you call the global south. There
Yeah,
are
true.
some countries that is the green transition a real emergency for them.
Yeah, absolutely very important point. First, let's start with how the big international financial institutions are acting, especially World Bank and IMF. They have abandoned providing loan for any coal industry or fossil fuel industry, which is unacceptable because we know that advanced economies are expanding this exploiting fossil fuel. Africa contributes not just the 3% annual to carbon emission, but if we look at historical cumulative measure, it has contributed only 0.5% in the last centuries. So there is no reason that anyone can tell that Africa should not develop coal. That's not the case. But let's look at the reality. In Africa, oil-based economies are growing slower than resource-poor countries. Resource-poor countries are like Rwanda, like my home country, Ethiopia. And the oil, petroleum-rich countries are not growing that level. And we have to link that economies like Angola, like Nigeria, they are highly dependent on oil, and their diversification of economy has significantly hampered their economic growth. So for them, they have to use their coal, they have to use their fossil fuel, but they have to use it not expecting after 100 years this will be driving the economy, because this resource will be depleted in a 50 years period. They have to use it to diversify, but no one has the moral authority to tell any African countries, don't use coal, don't use fossil fuel. So the key point is for oil producing by diversifying their economies, because fossil fuel is essentially extractive industry,
Exactly.
which does not have spillover effect, which does not create jobs. So this is one aspect, but we have to look. We are now investing to start investment in industrialization. It's not legacy economy. It's not first industrial revolution, second or third. We are just newcomers. So the question is, should we start building clean, green industrialization, or should we try to build and grow, which we are going to scrap tomorrow? China's growth path until year 2000 was to grow and grow and grow, and the environment was secondary. It was only after year 2000 China started to change model of growth. And Africa has an opportunity to combine how it can build green economy and also exploit existing resources. We have also to remember the current limitation of the technology. There is renewable energy, as we know, solar, wind, etc. But these are still intermittent energy sources. And we need a solid base, which is not yet developed. The energy source, which we call difficult to abate industries, are not yet developed. So for a basic support, they will need to rely on coal or fossil fuel, but then they have to invest on green energy, because green energy, like solar, is becoming cheaper than coal in year 2025 for the first time.
As long as we construct the whole industry around solar production, maybe within Africa, and that's maybe another debate.
You are absolutely right.
Another
because now
debate.
we only look at, for instance, we use solar for universal access. But the key issue is, how do you buy the solar?
Exactly.
Where is the foreign exchange?
Yeah.
And also, if you don't really create jobs with that, it will be a constraint. And what we have seen in our research is hydropower, for instance, generates, is clean energy, renewable energy, and has a domestic linkage effect significantly, creates jobs, develops cement industry and steel industries. So in renewable energy sources also, we need to look at which are the key drivers that will really help the continent to be competitive. But we have to understand the days of the fossil fuel are going to be gone, and those who will be winning are going to be who invest in green energy and in the future.
We still have 5 minutes before opening the floor to the audience, and I have one question to Mr. Massoud on my left. And given the context of the 2025 US National Security Strategy that explicitly elevates geoeconomics, corridor control, to core pillars of American power. So in this context, how can a country still be competitive if it's strategically exposed?
I think that, I don't know how many people have read the new national security strategy that's come out from the US last week. It encapsulates in a very explicit way some of the geostrategic priorities that the US attaches and the way it sees protecting its own economic security. But if you step back from it, it's an articulation of a change in the way in which not just the US, but other countries are looking at the interface between economics and national security. So economic policies have become much more influenced by politics domestically and by international politics, by competition, by rivalry amongst the US and China in the first instance, but more generally amongst great powers. And that means that for any country, any business now, you can't simply close your eyes and say, I'm going to carry on producing this and there'll be a market and I'll sell it because I'm competitive. You have to be much more aware of how people are going to respond. I'll give you a very simple, real example. China's exports to the US came under pressure because China has a huge surplus on its exports in the trade balance. And economists can argue that bilateral trade imbalances don't mean anything, but politically they do. So a lot of Chinese factories moved to Vietnam and started producing and exporting the same products from Vietnam to the US. And Chinese exports of those products to the US went down. In parallel, Vietnamese exports of the same products went up. That worked fine for a while. Vietnam's exports shot up by about 500 billion. And their imports were the same. So the trade imbalance between Vietnam and the US, which had been not important, suddenly becomes huge. And what happens? When the tariffs get imposed by the US, Vietnam gets hit with a very big tariff. So here's a good example of a country that got caught because it was exploiting its competitive advantage. Vietnam was able to make these exports possible because it was doing it at the right price, right quality, but it got caught in the geopolitics. And I think all countries have to recognize that the world in which they're operating is a world in which geopolitics can come in and hit. It's like a wave that might hit you from the side, that you're not prepared for it.
No,
and
it's a word, well, the WTO, where is the...
I think the WTO is struggling to be relevant in a world where some of the countries that were responsible for creating it are much less supportive of the rules and regulations that WTO operates with because they don't believe that these rules have served them well. Now, you can have a discussion about it, but that's what they believe. And so I guess I don't think it's just countries. It's very important also that we don't think this is a government responsibility.
Yeah.
This is basically companies.
Yeah.
Large companies that want to be big players have to be much more conscious of the politics within which they operate.
Exactly, and maybe help shape also public policies.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll now proceed to take some questions from the audience, and I count on your, please, precision and concision in asking the questions. So we have yeah, we'll have 4 at first round, and then we take another round. So we have the gentleman here, the lady over there, this beautiful lady here, and the gentleman behind me, and I have 4 and 5. Next round. Oh, didn't see you. Yes, please.
Hi, Rana Kapaldas. First question, general question around deglobalization. We've heard a lot of it. Does the pendulum swing back, or are we done with this globalization story? And then a question for Professor Lopez around intra-continental integration. Still optimistic or not, and how do we make this work?
Thank you. We take another question, I believe, is here.
Imandau. I'm a cybersecurity expert. I work on regulating the cyberspace and securing the cyberspace within the European Union. And my question is for you, Mrs. Lana. I'd like to reflect on what you said about the fact that digital literacy should be inclusive. Absolutely agree with you. It should be inclusive to the youth, of course, but to the elderly as well, especially in a context or in the context of African countries that are accelerating or starting their digitalization. I would love to hear from you on this very specific topic. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a hand over there. And then the last one is...
Thank you very much. My name is Maria, and I'm from Nigeria. I'm the founder of an early-stage tech fund called Open Seed, and I've lived in Europe the past 5 years, and I invest across Europe and Africa. One of the benefits of my work is because we look 10 years, 20 years into the future, these are the types of innovations we're trying to back, we tend to see the trends that are not emerging in data yet. And one of the things I've always thought about in my work is the powerful tool that technology and innovation can be to stimulating entrepreneurship and economies. That was pre, I guess, AI or even like the shifting world order. Now I'm thinking about technology as well as not just a geopolitical tool and intelligence. It's no longer on the periphery. It's changing how countries are being strategically relevant to the world. Anyways, I think my question is, how are we thinking about this point in time where there's a global disruptive technology that's evolving, and how we're thinking about policies that enable this? For a future we probably can't simulate because it's very different from the past. We had the radio, technologies in the 1920s. We had the dot-com boom in the 2000s. Now we have AI. I really think from what I see in my work that AI is grossly underestimated right now in how it will impact our future. That's one point. And then on the other hand, there is a relation between technology and, I guess, the sovereignty of local financial ecosystems. Venture capital is a massive driver of global economies. And we see a lot of development financing locally towards catalyzing the ecosystem. I would love to hear the thoughts on how we use this moment in time to build resilient local financing, given in the last 5 years, 80% of the financing has gone out of the continent and most of it is aid. Just would love to hear the thoughts from the room around that.
Thank you, Maria. And we'll have a question from here.
Hello, everyone. So Noureddin from Morocco. I'm part of the Emerging Leaders program. My question was about the energy transition, energy agenda that we were talking about. I just feel that we keep saying that I think it's important to diversify, but I think it's as important to invest in a local production of these technologies, because otherwise it's going to just create another dependency. If we don't know how to really build our electrolyzers, our solar panels, our pipelines, we will just repeat again the same scenario. So how, as African countries, can we shape our own energy agenda? And to build up on the second point, we keep talking about the LLMs and large language models. I think what is powering all these large language models are data centers. And if we don't know how to build these data centers and how to empower them and give the correct power, it's, again, another dependency, and it will just be at the end of the supply chain. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. You said
Nordin.
Nordin, sorry.
Yes.
Last question from the first round of questions to the gentleman here.
Right. Hung Tran from the Policy Center for the New South. I would like to draw upon Masood's statement and ask a concrete question. What concrete advice would you give to developing countries being squeezed by US protectionism and China's overproduction and mercantilism? Basically, China wants to manufacture everything, export everything to everyone, but buy only oil, minerals, and Hermes handbags.
And solar too, I think. Okay. Deglobalization, I think the question was addressed to Mr. Masood, right?
I'm happy to answer.
Or who, I'm sorry. Please feel free to answer this question about deglobalization. Akube.
I may intervene on this deglobalization. The short answer is, to my understanding, not much fundamental has changed. Because when we see globalization, we have to remember it's not only about putting tariffs. We have to look about the mobility of FDI. We know historically the highest point when FDI reached was globally in 2007, which had reached over 2 trillion. Up to now, it has decreased even after 15 or nearly 2 decades. But this change did not happen during Trump's time or last 1 year. It mainly started happening after 2009 financial crisis. Also, let's look at the financialization. The momentum has not slowed down. On trade, we have seen some restriction, but we have to remember that the trade volume and value is increasing every year, despite this restriction. So globalization has not changed, and openness of economies, I believe, will continue to be to boost or drive globalization, but there are substantial elements at the global policy dialogue that need to be looked at and that will shape. And the key factor here is the global South's role, contribution in global trade, and also global GDP, which is now nearly 50%, is going to influence.
So deglobalization, and there was another question about AI, right?
Continental free trade area?
And they just said, if you I'd like to just pick up on two things that were raised. I think they're both difficult, to which I don't think there's a simple answer. One is the question that was raised towards the end, does Africa run the risk of being the last in the chain? You know, AI is going to be developed elsewhere, data centers will be outside. How should we deal with that? Should we be producing in Africa all the new materials and equipment that you need to put in place? Or should you be buying cheap solar panels from China or not? So I think that's the question. And it's going to be a question of balance, but it's also a question of where can you invest the money. Data centers are very expensive. You know, a 1 gigawatt data center costs between $30 and $60 billion. Now, you know, you want to put in five gigawatt data center somewhere, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. That's how we run into these trillions of dollars numbers about AI investment. And the question then becomes, where do you want to invest the limited resources that countries have, and how will you be able to mobilize that? And the same thing applies to the question of how do you use, do you produce locally, or do you use what is cheapest available? And obviously you can't rely on just importing forever. But there are things where if you start producing, you have to realize at what is the price that you're willing to pay for that. And I would say today, that's Hung's last point. I want to end on that. Hung raised this question, what is the best way to cope now between protectionism from the US? I would actually say also, by the way, protectionism from Europe, just not quite as visible, but not in the same things. But CBAM was the example that, Carlos, you used. How do you cope between protectionism on the one side and the overproduction and the excess supply in China for a lot of these products, which is resulting in a price point that is virtually impossible to compete against for emerging markets and for developing countries generally? And what is the advice that you give to a country caught in the middle of that? I think this is a question that actually we're going to have to face in the next 2, 3, 5 years, which is you can't have every country's industrial production capacity being made obsolete because there is excess supply in the largest producing economy in the world. You create the world's manufacturing factories in China, and everybody else that set up factories, assuming a certain cost structure, suddenly finds that they're being undercut. And I don't think that politically and socially it's going to be sustainable. And by the way, not just emerging markets. Listen to what Europe is saying. Listen to what the US has said. And I think you'll find that a general issue around.
Okay, so we have a question to Lana about security and youth, and also about the elderly and how they use technology and how should we protect them.
Well, cybersecurity and youth, I don't know if it's working.
It's working.
There are two different issues. AI definitely will enhance cybersecurity issue all over the world, and more cyber crimes. We will see that increasing all over the world. That's something that there is no like legal framework to, control, and that's something that the U.S. and the global power have to address, because it's going to be a big issue in the future. For the youth and the elderly, that's, I think, a different topic, and how to include technology in their education and advancement and development. I think some of the countries have already kind of created some education program regarding the AI, and EU is already including coding and AI education in all their public schools. American schools are a little bit behind. They're not really, it's not established all over the US, but India is increasing. Singapore also is, the Gulf countries are including in their curriculum in elementary schools and higher AI and coding. Elderly, I think that will be more complex to, address, and how to train the elderly, especially in developing countries, especially in poor countries, in Africa, where you don't even have electricity, you don't have internet. So a lot of poor countries don't have any basic, technological, capabilities and solutions. So that will be a more complex issue to address. But in general, the countries and the governments have to put youth as a priority in their agenda and in their political economies, because if they want to compete, they're going to compete on the human capital, and how they can be racing into development without addressing that part. That will be a total failure unless we want to eliminate the humans on this planet, and we will have just robots managing all of us. So it's not easy, it's complex, and I think especially on the elderly side, a lot of research needs to be done how to create programs and initiatives to support that.
Okay. Carlos, I think a question was addressed to you, and also if you can answer the lady from the startup sphere, and especially with public policies, are they catching up with all the evolution of the market? And maybe also the question was about venture capital and the resilience of venture capital within a smaller scale. I hope that I managed to gather all
I think
the information.
we had a question from Ronak on the continental free trade area. I think it's very important that we bear in mind that the timeline for putting together a free trade area with the characteristics of the African one is very complex. So we have now close to 90% agreement on common tariffs. That is not a small achievement. And if you look into the various steps that the European Union, the most complex and articulated free trade area, has gone through, we are not sort of late in relation to that comparison. However, the speed has changed. The speed of the environment is different. So we cannot afford to have the same sort of timeline as others have had before. Which brings me to the question of whether we are newcomers or latecomers. You, Arkebe, said we are newcomers. We are more like latecomers. Because if we were newcomers, it's like we are, basically at leading transformation of some sorts, and we are not. We are latecomers because we are coming to the party when everybody else has already had a very good meal. So we're trying to, just see what is left. And of course, it's very difficult. But we have some advantages as latecomers. One of the advantages of latecomers is that you can leapfrog. Of course, this is easily said because you leapfrog, but the landing strip keeps moving. So you leapfrog and then you keep falling, because the speed is completely different. And this is why we have to make disruption our job description. Disruption is our job description. As latecomers, you cannot really do otherwise, which obliges us to navigate in a different way from others. Others are protecting their savings. They have accumulated incredible savings. So in Europe, they have amazing demographic stress. But they have savings that will carry them for a while. We don't have that kind of challenge. Our challenge is different. Our challenge is to create wealth, is to distribute wealth, is to create opportunities for the youth. This is a very different proposition. And in this proposition, our navigation requires some fundamentals to be understood. And I think most people miss it. The first fundamental that we need to understand is that there is a difference in the tech space between innovation and consumption. You can have the best ecosystems in the places that have infrastructure, energy. Like, for instance, now your data centers most likely are going to be in the Middle East because they have huge capital and energy to be able to fund them and so on. That part, the innovation part, the infrastructure part, requires a different set of elements that we don't have in Africa. However, who is going to consume these tech-intensive products? Is it the old people? Well, just go around the room and ask if the old people can compete with their kids. When you talk about digital natives, they are mostly African. We don't realize that. So that's the consumption part. So as tech intensity increases, the consumption market of the future is African. And that is a very different proposition that we need to understand. And that requires a complete, sort of mindset for us to harness this opportunity. The same in relation to energy. Yes, it is true that nobody has the moral authority to be telling us how to use our fossil fuels, particularly when the only money that we seem to be able to mobilize outside is for fossil fuels.
Exactly.
We get around 3% of the funding for renewables from abroad. So, how can you be teaching us a lesson and the money is going to the things that you don't like? However, I think it's very important for us to realize that for Africa, it's not either or. We need all of it. It's the same thing as, in East Africa discussion whether we should have the Djibouti port competing with the Mombasa port or the Hargeisa port. We need all of them. Because, just comparing our GDP in the year 2000 and our GDP 25 years later, we have more than double. And we will continue to double because of demographics. So we need all of it. That's the consumption. And I think we kind of miss these kind of points because we have a narrative that is always very negative about Africa. And I'm going to land on the issues that the lady asked, because I think they are extremely important and very shrewd questions. The first is about what is the next disruptor after AI? Because she's worried about the future, or worried not, interested about the future. The next disruptor is going to be quantum computing. Quantum computing is going to completely erase the encryption models as we know them. That is going to create a complete mess in relation to the way we organize value. The same point that I was making in relation to AI is going to be amplified by quantum computing. That's just one aspect. Another one is that it's going to disrupt the way we deal with systems of payments, including third-party currencies, including the dollar domination. We don't like the crypto. We consider it a bit fuzzy. Well, we better get used to similar types of products, because those are the ones who are going to be in the world of the new encryption models that are going to emerge. And that is going to be a very different world that gives a lot of opportunities for latecomers. It's not that we are going to invent it, but we can get used to those types of new models of consumption, of processing, methodologies, because the younger population is going to adopt them more quickly than older population. So we have to understand demographic stress is going to move from where people think it is, Africa, because of the youth boom and all that, all these neo-Malthusian ways of interpreting demographics. It's going to move to aging, very well said by all here in this panel, but aging in an accelerated form. It's happening already. It's going to be so fast that, Masood, I think the Chinese manufacturing is threatened. And right now they have overcapacity and all that. They are already looking for opportunities to dish out labor-intensive whatever. Is it production of textiles? Is it production of toys, because we are close to Christmas? They want to get rid of all of that, and it's going to land partly in Africa, not only in Africa, but partly in Africa, because that's low value addition that the Chinese cannot maintain because of their demographic profile and the costs of their labor and the costs of robotization and automation. They don't make it very competitive to apply to that type of industry. So that's a chance for us to create jobs. But it's a window that is not going to last more than 15 years or so, because otherwise, it's not going to be a big value. Because the value extraction is going to keep moving. It moved from agriculture to manufacturing to services to financial systems. Now it's going to move into AI.
So it's not an overrated idea.
Not at all.
Yes, Harkebe.
Yeah, I just want to comment on 2 points. One is issue of energy and linking it with industrial capability, which was raised quite perfectly by our colleague. And now we are talking about Africa. What we need to remember is Africa is so diverse. We are not talking about one China, one India. We are talking about 54 countries. So let's try to link it with some cases. We are here, Rabat, in the capital of Morocco. And let's try to understand from a Moroccan context how this energy has been moving. And we know that Morocco has been investing in green technologies, in renewable. Actually, the first concentrated power project was at least developed 10 years back. And we have seen this extraordinary commitment. At that time, that technology was so expensive. Now has become cheaper. But Morocco has been linking it with developing innovation capability at the renewable energy projects and also Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. And they have really made some lead in this perspective. Even now, Morocco is coming up with hydrogen valleys development, electrolysis, etc. And OCP is also working on on the green ammonia aspect. So what we understand from here is countries in Africa are making significant progress, and it's not uniform across the continent, but we are really seeing good progress, and I see Morocco one of the economies that is well positioned to be competitive. Second point, let's talk about the industry. In this continent, we have seen, in a period of 20 years, a very competitive automotive industry can be built from scratch. And this was a huge investment by the Moroccan government, a significant political commitment, building Mid-Tanger industrial complex, the ports, attracting FDI, which now is Morocco exporting 8 billion or 9 billion to Europe. So here what we have to see is, we are not talking about abstract things, but the investment in energy has to go together with productive capacity, and there is huge potential to develop these capabilities. I can also talk about Ethiopia. When I talk about energy, I want to bring one important element we haven't yet mentioned. Africa should develop energy because it's contributed significantly to GDP. South Africa, where energy relies on coal, more than 80%, where there is serious shortage of energy, GDP is lost by 2.2 to 3% of GDP growth, and it will be impossible to create adequate employment because small business, large businesses without energy cannot do anything. So if we want high growth, double digit, we have to invest in energy. The second point we also need to consider is, how do we develop energy? It requires huge capital investment. And when we talk about energy, we only talk about external finance. And this is a critical balance of payment constraints. And here, the answer is only one. A country that is committed for energy, that wants to end poverty, that wants to build industrial capacity, must put it as a priority, and domestic resource mobilization is a key driver. This is what we learned from Morocco. This is what we learned from Ethiopia. Ethiopia is, despite its a low-income economy, it has put enormous money to energy, including the latest over 5,000 megawatt power generating, entirely financed domestically, without a single penny from World Bank or China, entirely domestically. This is important not only for universal coverage, but for industrial capacity and job creation, but even to attract data centers to Africa. We are already observing many are trying to explore Africa for many reasons, because the data centers require not only energy, but the energy has to be affordable. It has to be cheaper. Then it requires a lot of water, and it requires telecom service, of course. So I want to highlight African country which is truly committed to development, to growth. An indicator whether it's real commitment is whether it invests in energy or not. A country that invests in energy is a country that builds its own future. This is a point I want to highlight. Brief one in 1 minute on this African free trade area. Me and Carlos, both of us are members of the board of AFCFTA. I want to highlight two elements. First, union or trade area is not a miracle you can build in 2 to 3 years. Let's look at Europe, where there is over 60% intra-Europe trade. Europe didn't even start with union. It started mainly, the initiative was a political project to end war after World War II, and started collaboration with coal and gradually moved. So in a period of 8 years is what Europe has really achieved in the European Union, and there are also a lot of tensions, as we all know quite well. Then there is ASEAN, which is in Asia. intra-trade is still not far from African trade. It's about 21 or 22%. But that has been a very dynamic region. The global value chain has been concentrated in ASEAN economies. For us, Africa, when we look at this, the key missing element is, what do you want to trade? Do you want to trade skin and hides? We have to produce, we have to manufacture if it's going to be a real trade based on value addition and based on industrial capability. And this is where we need to work. And it's not going to happen because of AFCFTA. It's going to happen especially by governments who are pursuing industrial policy, who are investing in productive transformation. The second challenge we need to address is this is a big continent, but as we all know, it's not connected in terms of infrastructure. Harmonization of customs procedures need to be built. So this requires enormous fund, and it has to be economical to build them, and it's going to take us some time. So one is we shouldn't over-expect, but secondly also, the foundational element is investing in productive transformation, investing in industrial capacity is the only way that the continent can emerge stronger and bigger market size.
I think the time is up. We need to wrap up. One final word, Mr. Massoud, shortly.
I make one point. If I were to take one single thing away, it's this issue of speed of change. And the reason I say that is because our whole systems, particularly the decision-making processes in the government, in most of our governments, were designed to slowly and deliberately make decisions. But now we can't afford that. We have to be making decisions much more quickly, and we have to be ready to change our mind if the world changes. So if I have a single plea for, I think most of this will come from the private sector. But if there's one thing governments can do to make things work better, it's to look at their processes for regulatory approval, for decision-making, and be willing to change the speed at which we make those decisions.
Thank you. But as Keynes once said, the the difficulty is not about developing ideas, but erasing old ones. Thank you. Thank you, Massoud. Thank you, Lana. Thank you again, Carlos. Thank you, Arkebe. It was very enriching. Thank you.